Welcome back to the Bear Market Brief podcast. As always, I'm your host, Aaron. Today we begin a two-part series called Populist. In today's episode, we'll be exploring all facets of Vladimir Putin's popularity and what that popularity even means. And next episode, we'll be tackling a tough question. Is Vladimir Putin a populist? Joining us today is Yana Govokhovskaia. Yana researches and writes about Russian domestic politics. Her work has been published in Democratization, Russian Politics, Post-Soviet Affairs, Russian Analytical Digest, and the Ponar's Policy Memo series, among others. So, let's dive in. Yana, so great to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
So we have a very interesting day in Russian politics, to say the least. Yesterday saw the referendum results come down that could theoretically keep Putin in power for life until 2036. So to dive right in here, I wanted to talk about the results. We had 78% voted, or theoretically voted yes on the referendum, with 68% turnout. So yeah, to start things, if you're Putin this morning, are you happy with that result?
Well, I'm sure he's very happy with the result. I'm surprised by the result, not by the fact that it's a positive outcome, that it's a majority yes vote, but by the fact that the actual result is so much higher than any of the polling suggested it would be. I mean, Levada, the Russia's independent pollster, was doing polling in May and June, and they were saying about 55% of people polled were planning to vote yes, with about a 45% of people asked reporting that they intended to vote. So, to go from 45% planning to vote to a 68% actual turnout, and from a 55% intended yes vote to a 78% yes vote, that's a huge discrepancy. So, I mean, they went above and beyond to really deliver this overwhelming endorsement of these amendments, which I find surprising. I thought they would sort of steer much closer to what the pre-vote polling said.
Yeah, to say the least. I think successful as far as the use of administrative resources, as they're called. For listeners less in the loop, since I use some jargon, that just means using political, economic levers to turn people out to secure the desired results. And I think the results in this case were very much desired. But let's turn to the kind of the meat and potatoes of this episode. This is the first part of a two-part series, Populist, and today we're talking all about Putin's popularity. So to play devil's advocate from the very get-go here, isn't Putin an autocrat? Why would popularity matter at all in a liberal system?
Yeah, so Putin is definitely an autocrat, but that just means that he heads a system that is not representative of people's wishes. Being an autocrat is not the same as being a dictator, and autocrats have to make a calculus about how they intend to rule, because you either rule with people's support or you rule using repressive measures. So you either need to use security services, the police, the military to force people to obey, or you have to actually convince a portion of the population to support you. And then you can use, as you mentioned, administrative resources, economic incentives, other things to kind of top up that support. So popularity is still important, even when you're not in a democratic system. It's just that popularity doesn't mean the same thing when we're talking about authoritarian systems versus democratic systems.
Got it. Makes sense. So I guess then kind of taking this a step further, we're trying to understand in this episode specifically, is Putin popular and what popularity might mean, especially in a system that's not, I saw it referred to this morning as a soft authoritarian system or a loose democratic system. I guess there's a lot of different terms you could use. But let's talk about the basis, whether or not you agree with everything Putin does. He's held power for 20 years. So there is some fundamental base of support, I think it's safe to say. So let's talk about kind of where that support is based on. What makes him popular with that kind of amorphous definition of popularity for now, but how has he held on so long?
Yeah, so I'm not a huge fan of the different kind of, they used to be called democracy with adjectives, and now I guess it's authoritarianism with adjectives, right? All these kind of ways of describing this particular regime. I think it's enough to say that Russia is an authoritarian regime. You can say it's electoralism, which means that it still has elections as the primary vehicle for obtaining and maintaining political power, but it has authoritarian tendencies or strategies within its political system. So I think Putin, as you say, is genuinely popular. And we can see that his popularity over time fluctuates, right? So he had the famous Crimea bounce after the annexation of Crimea. His popularity really skyrocketed. Before that, then, though, in 2011, 2012, kind of on the wave of the democratic protests, his popularity was lower. It was not very low, but it was lower. It was in the 60s, kind of closer to the territory it is now. And the Kremlin is actually famously ratings obsessed. So the Kremlin uses polling agencies and sociological studies to actually study what people want, how they feel about the government. So it's not as if Putin or the Kremlin are kind of ruling from the top without any regard for what people want. And we see them kind of operationalize or use certain parts of society to increase their popularity. So we saw around Crimea, and before that, we saw kind of nationalism and like the Cossacks and all of these movements that already existed in Russian society. They weren't invented by the Kremlin, they existed, but they were sort of on the margins. And then the Kremlin really engaged with them. And then after kind of the conflict in eastern Ukraine really became a frozen conflict, and you saw the Kremlin pull back from the whole idea of Novaya Rossiya and this greater kind of Russian identity, then they started really going after these nationalists in Russia, right? They were prosecuted in extremist cases, and that ideology was abandoned. The same thing with, traditional family values. Russia is, when you look at world value surveys, Russia is no more homophobic or kind of, religious than a lot of other Eastern European countries, but this ideology has been picked up by the Kremlin and then kind of promoted. And so they use parts of existing tendencies and ideas in society and maintain popular support that way. I mean, it's not that different from what you see politicians in the West do, right? Kind of latch onto ideas or popular sentiments in society and use them in their political platforms. And of course, I mean, in a broader story, the economic recovery of the 2000s, the oil prices, all of those things helped Putin in his first 2 terms as president to be genuinely popular. It's just the question of the difference between how popular he is and then the administrative resources. The question is how big of a margin there is between those two things, between the popularity we actually see it and his real.
Yeah, so I guess a relevant question here. What explains the particular? This is something we've covered in BMB, I think, since the get-go. But the Kremlin's pretty intense focus on optics specifically. There's a pretty strong sensitivity about the way things look and securing the right numbers. I mean, the fact that an approval rating in the 60th, in the 60 percentile, that's by all democratic standards, a very high rating. So what drives that sensitivity towards numbers and public sentiment, especially given that it's democracy light, we could call it?
Yeah, so what drives it is the fact that in a democratic system, your popularity rating is pretty closely tied to your re-election prospects, right? When a president in a democratic system, a presidential system, heads into a re-election season, if his ratings or chances of being reelected are diminished or slim. In Russia, because elections are not actually representative of public opinion, because they are manipulated, and they're manipulated, we should remember, locally and regionally. So there is an idea about Russia that everything is controlled from the top down, and almost mechanically controlled, sort of personally controlled. But that's not quite true. What the Kremlin does is send signals from the top about results and outcomes they would wish to see, and they have people in the regions and locally working to accomplish those results, but they don't know exactly what results they're aiming for sort of precisely. And so sometimes we have kind of bending the stick too far, when you see, results from Chechnya or somewhere else with like 99% turnout and 85% support, something like that. So the Kremlin actually doesn't want those kinds of results, right? They want to see significant support, but sometimes or could be perceived as legitimate, right? And so when you have this, the idea that their ratings obsessed, it's because they don't actually get to see their genuine support in elections. Like, elections not reflective. The media is also controlled, right? So when you're looking at alternative kind of voices and criticisms, you don't find that in the media. So the Kremlin actually has very few touchstones to see what people want. And they are concerned that that they maintain a certain level of support, because again, as I said before, if you don't have genuine support, at least in some part of the population, maybe not the majority, you're going to have to use repressive force. And that's costly, it's unpopular, it has a lot of different consequences, and most autocrats would want to avoid that.
Got it. So we talked about briefly, but I want to kind of circle back here to the use of different political movements, different ideas in society as a tool to build power, sort of different social contracts that have existed over Putin's 1.0. Are we on Putin 4.0 by now, I guess? But regardless of the various iterations of Putinism, can we walk through, I think for listeners it would be helpful to kind of understand how the kind of political organizational principles have changed. What are the ideas that have been harped on, and where does that leave us now? We're still kind of, you mentioned kind of conservative social framework that was baked into the Constitution now as a result of this referendum. But yeah, where do we stand now, and where have we come from?
Right. So I think one of the things we haven't touched on yet, which is important and something that people may not think about when they're looking at popularity ratings for Putin, is that there are, practically speaking, no alternatives to him. And sometimes that's kind of said in the Russian context like a joke. Putin is Russia is Putin. There's no one without, there's nothing without him. He's the entire system. And we kind of came close to that in the interview he just gave last week, where he sort of said, let's not look for alternatives. Let's not look for successors. Let's do the job of government, suggesting that, there's no one better than him in sort of doing this job. But we arrived at this place really over the course of 20 years. It may seem now like this was inevitable, but that really wasn't the case, right? He spent his first two terms, so really Putin's first two terms, the first decade of the 2000s, was devoted to building the power vertical, which is a system where everyone reports to their immediate superior, and the system is centralized in Moscow. All decision-making is centralized in Moscow. So he built that. This was overcoming kind of the chaotic decentralization that Yeltsin had really had established by default, because Russia was not in a place in the late 1990s to be any other way. So building the power vertical, then and in the process eliminating regional elites that could be any kind of opponents or any kind of competition. Again, the regional elites were a problem for Yeltsin in his time. Then we saw the emergence of United Russia, right? You needed this vehicle of power, this political party. And then you saw a system kind of coalesce, a political party system coalesce around United Russia. So you had United Russia, then you had the systemic opposition, which were the only political parties allowed to take part in elections and allowed to be elected to the federal and the regional parliaments. And then you have the next section, which is sort of the Medvedev era, right? You have the system kind of comes together, then Putin faces the constitutional term limit issue. So he steps back. Then he comes back, and we see a problem emerge immediately, right? We have the 2011-2012 protests, because all of a sudden we see that the system is lacking legitimacy, right? Putin all of a sudden comes back, and it's as if they had this plan all along, which they probably, we don't know whether or not Medvedev had their kind of their deal all along that Putin was going to come back. But all of a sudden, people feel disappointed. They feel like the system actually isn't representative. It's not legitimate. And then almost very closely following that, we have Crimea. So we have the focus of the legitimacy of the system shift. to these foreign policy accomplishments, right? Russia's tougher stance on the international, internationally, we have the benefit of Crimea, and then we have that slowly fall off. And we see the Kremlin searching for other things to base their legitimacy on. And then we have, the West is the great apple, the foreign foreign NGO laws, the traditional family values. So the system has been created where there is a power vertical. Putin is at the top in the center. There are no political alternatives to him because the political framework has been made up in a way where all alternatives look just incapable, because he hasn't allowed any competition to take place around himself or really in the political system. And then we have these waves of different kinds of ideologies that the Kremlin is looking for as a basis for legitimacy, because competition isn't a basis for legitimacy anymore. I mean, that's been the slate has been wiped clean. And the problem happens, when we see downshifts in his popularity has been really declining since the Crimea bounce has been declining, because they have had to take unpopular decisions, policy decisions. I mean, the pension reform of 2018 was highly unpopular, and Putin had to actually come out and defend it publicly, which was surprising. I mean, it's one of the only times he's come out and defended an unpopular political decision. So the government is still forced to make these sorts of decisions that will make people unhappy. And then the question is, where can you scrounge up more popularity once you make those decisions?
So, relevant question, kind of the flip side of the basis for Putin's popularity, but I think it would also be valuable to talk through the threats that have emerged to his popularity and the kind of factors that have hurt him. And an example I like to bring up, dating very, very early in the Putin administration, was the Kursk disaster. When the submarine sank, Putin very famously publicly kind of bungled the response, came across as very kind of cardboard, wooden, didn't express the kind of compassion that a leader would needed to. And early in his administration suffered a downtick in his approval. So there's certainly been episodes where this has happened. But summarizing it, kind of where has Putin struggled as far as building and maintaining legitimacy through popularity?
Yeah, so he's not great at crisis management, and we saw that again during the ongoing pandemic, right? He does not see himself, despite the fact that he has created a system which is very personalized, in which he is sort of the decision maker and the problem solver, right? We have these 3 or 4 hour press conferences that he has, the call-in show, and then he personally will address some village in Siberia or something like that. Despite the fact that he has that image, when there is an actual crisis, he's not great about it. So the Kursk, early on, the Kursk disaster was an example of that. He waited a long time to kind of address it publicly. Then he had the disastrous meeting with the relatives where, he kind of implied that he should just accept this as the fate of military or Navy personnel in Russia. And going forward, the Beslan hostage taking, he wasn't great about that either. He was slightly better in that he addressed it sort of faster, but he was not. He didn't take the role of grieving with families, of being sort of the emotional kind of leader of a nation. And we see that his response is more about being strong and taking action, not being kind of engaged with people's emotions in crisis. The other thing that he often does is delegate responsibility and more often blame for disasters to regional elites, right? Regional elites are now so there was a period of time. Now governors are elected. This happened in 2012, but there was a period of time where governors were appointed, right? And this was in direct response to, the logic was that because of Beslan, they needed to be appointed, but really this was a way of centralizing power. And so for a long period of time, regional elites, governors were appointed, which means they were dependent on the Kremlin, and they weren't, accountable to the population of the region. Now they are being elected, but there's still the system of their kind of political local machines had been totally destroyed over that course of appointments. And so now they're still dependent on the Kremlin. And so they answer kind of to the top. They don't answer downward to the constituents. And what Putin has been doing over time is that he blames regional elites for any kind of failures. We saw this with the forest fires. We saw, this again and again and again. And he delegates responsibility, authority, and blame downward, and then is able to kind of stay above the fray. I would say that with the pandemic, it seems like it's not working as well anymore. We kind of also saw this with the pension reforms. The pension reforms were introduced in the summer of 2018, they were introduced right after Putin was reelected. But the protests around them started in the summer. And then we saw governors voted out, United Russia governors voted out for the first time ever based on this protest vote, because people can't vote out Putin. So they're voting out these other kind of his stand-ins in the region. So I think that's a major hurdle to his popularity, maintaining his popularity. This strategy of offloading blame to the regional elites may not be, it's not a kind of forever strategy. And the worsening economic situation, which is now kind of escalated with the pandemic globally, will certainly hurt Putin, because a lot of his strategy in maintaining support is really giving handouts, sort of economic handouts, to people. But also taking credit for an improving economic situation, or at least being able to say, look, we have sanctions, we have, the oil prices falling, but at least we have Crimea. And again, that seems to be wearing off. And there's not a second Crimea. Like, I think people kind of fear what would happen to Russia's neighbors if Putin was looking for another popularity bounce. But I think the reality is there is no second Crimea that would work that way in Russia.
So let's actually, related to kind of the ability to bounce popularity, we see the economy has been essentially declining or stagnant, although the Russian central bank, they like to say it's positive stagnation, slight growth.
Yeah.
I don't know if a lot of average Russians see it that way, but let's talk about where Putin could derive more popularity over this next term through up to possibly including 2036. So we have the economy maybe not very dependable, at least for the next couple of years, and with demographic pressures that may be a continued kind of thorn in his side. We have the patriotism, military strength, maybe limits there. Also wanted to float Putin's ability to be cool. Again, thinking back really early in his term, some of the language he used in describing Chechen extremists kind of had a swagger to him that, well, he's not as young as he was then. So can we walk through the avenues he could have to get his popularity to a better place, if that's possible at all?
Yeah, so I think that the cult of personality route is probably not available to Putin. I mean, the kitschy stuff from a decade ago around, videos like A Man Like Putin and shirtless photos of him in Siberia and things like that, or, his kind of street language to address Chechen terrorists. I'm not sure those were part of like a cohesive strategy. He really hasn't built the kind of cult of personality that we see in maybe Central Asian countries. He hasn't invested a great deal of time and effort or media pressure to kind of build that. And I'm not sure Russians are, it's hard to say, but I'm not sure Russians are up for that either. I'm not sure that would be kind of a popular move, especially with younger Russians, or maybe not even younger Russians, but middle-aged Russians. So anyone that's not a pensioner, essentially. So I'm not sure about that route. In terms of popularity, I think, taking opportunities to be an influential actor in the Middle East with foreign policy might be a way to kind of, that's still a big foreign policy accomplishments are still a big part of what Putin is offering people. And also, I think the other thing is that we have to consider what he's trying to get out of his rule too, right? Yes, obviously he wants to stay in power. That's the ultimate. This is something that is similar across democracies and autocracies. people in political power may have other goals, but one of their goals is maintaining their political power, right? People want to get reelected, people want to get reappointed, they want to stay in power to accomplish whatever other goals. So obviously one of Putin's goals is to stay in power. But another one, I think, realistically, is that he is building a foreign policy legacy. There are accomplishments that he wants to kind of secure, and rebuilding Russia's stature on the world stage has been a pretty obvious and primary goal of his for a long time, starting way back when he made his famous Munich speech, right, about how Russia has been disrespected and kind of marginalized with NATO and the EU and things like that. So I think he's going to keep going with a foreign policy, or what he views as accomplishments. I think, the job of selling those accomplishments to people will become harder over time. And I'm not sure kind of the avenues for an economic recovery. I mean, the oil, deal, kind of the double whammy of the pandemic and then the crash in the oil prices that happened earlier in the year was a big miscalculation. It seemed like strategic miscalculation on the part of the Kremlin. And so clearly they're trying to improve the economy where they can, but to what degree they're capable of doing that is also up in the air, right? I mean, now they're getting rid of the flat tax. I mean, there's things they can do, but one of the biggest problems is that there's all these sanctions, and also that the climate of kind of corruption inhibits foreign investment, which is a serious problem for Russia as well. But so one of the questions that I've been thinking about as this discussion about popularity and voting and all of this takes place is the degree to which popularity really matters. I mean, yes, it matters in the sense that they don't want to use repressive tools. But the reality is that Putin himself is not facing an election anytime soon. United Russia might be facing elections. I mean, obviously there's regional elections every year. There will be a Duma election soon. But there's ways of accomplishing the results that you want in those elections. We just saw some of them in operation during this last week of voting in the referendum. So there is, I think, a lot of wiggle room available to Putin in his kind of maintaining his popularity, and the degree to which that's important. If what you really want to examine is the durability of the regime, which I don't think hinges on his popularity.
So speaking of regime durability, that's about as good a segue as we could have possibly had here. Russia, at least in its own popular imagination or the national ideal, talks about itself as the Third Rome. And I think very interesting, especially now, because the Roman Empire, for all of its strengths and endurance as a political unit, never figured out succession. It caused a lot of bloodshed, a lot of difficulty. There was never an established system. They did it sometimes by lineage, by dynasty, but never an institutionalized way of handing off power. So I wanted to ask, especially since Putin may now stay another 16 years, although that seems like a lot, to what extent does succession and lasting legitimacy play in here to his calculation?
Yes, I think that as I said before, I think in his calculation, he is building himself a legacy based on foreign policy accomplishments. I think that's the primary goal of his, at least now in the last, I would say, probably in the last maybe 5 to 10 years. He's finished, it seems to me he is wholeheartedly disinterested in domestic policies. He doesn't take a lot of initiatives. He only comes out and sort of defends them, as he did with the pension reform, when they are in dire need. First of all, the pension system really, really needed to be reformed and has needed to be reformed for a long time. And so Putin comes out in favor of these reforms that are absolutely needed, but he's not taking sort of great initiatives, to kind of build new things in the country or kind of build new social programs, policies. He keeps calling paternity capital idea, which it's internationally we've seen you can't pay women to have children. It won't work as a demographic policy. So in terms of his accomplishments and whether or not, he'll stay for another 16 years, I think it's unlikely that he'll stay for another 16 years. I'll say that, and I'll say that I'm completely prepared to be wrong, partly because of how this constitutional reform has unfolded. So when the constitutional amendments were proposed in January, so obviously none of us really thought that Putin was going to sail into the sunset after this term. Like no one thought that realistically. But obviously we also all knew that he was facing this problem of term limits, constitutional term limits. So something had to be done. And then they announced these constitutional reforms in January. And if you remember the speech that he made in January, it was about political renewal, the demand for reformation, for transition, for renewal, for a rebalancing of power. He was talking about empowering different institutions. And then the entire government was sacked or quit, right? And then there's this whole kind of upheaval. And it seemed like we were seeing a real political, an effort at a real political change, not kind of democratization or liberalization, but an effort to reform the system, to maybe make it more durable. And then when it came right down to it, he went with the bluntest, most kind of obvious ploy to stay in power, which is to extend the possibility of being president for 16 more years, which, again, I think very few people expected, because he had avoided changing the Constitution for such a long time, and he had made statements about not changing the Constitution, not being in power, and because it just seemed so blatantly undemocratic. And then everything that's built up after that, the way that the reform has been implemented, the constitutional amendments, the way that this vote happened, not that they got a positive result, but that this vote isn't based in law, and it was held in just in the most illegitimate kind of way possible, right? Like voting outside, voting by, via the internet, all these different kinds of things. There was no effort made at kind of appearing legitimate. So all of that surprises me. It really, really does, because I would have thought they would have been way more strategic. And so I'll go back to say that I don't think he's going to stay president for 16 years. But again, I say that because I think that he is a strategic actor, and that it would make sense to transition out of the presidency before he faces this conflict again. And also because he's getting older over time, right? And people are not going to expect him to live to be 100. And I don't think his goal is to die in office. So I don't think he's going to stay president for 16 years. But I say that because I think he's a strategic actor. If he's not a strategic actor, he'll stay in power for another 16 years, and then we'll have kind of a very tough transition period. And the last thing I'll say there is, and this goes back to your point about Rome. So there's all these studies that look at the end of an autocrat's career. And one of the things that we often don't consider, but that studies have shown us, is that autocrats are more often than not replaced by other autocrats. They're not replaced by democratic leaders. So when we talk about political transition in Russia, it is very possible that whoever replaces Putin, whatever system replaces him, won't be a democracy. And so that's something else I think to consider also, right? When we look towards the end of Putin's career, that might not be a democratic breakthrough that we're hoping for.
And on that optimistic note, I think we've covered all of the bases about the various elements of Putin's popularity. So thank you, Yana, again for joining us. Great to hear your thoughts on the matter.
Great, thanks.
Thank you as always for joining, and as mentioned, stay tuned for part 2 coming out soon. Be sure to follow BMB Russia and Ukraine on Twitter at the handle @BearMarketBrief. BMB Russia and Ukraine is a project of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.